I'm Anthony Scaramucci, and welcome to Open Book, where I talk with some of the most interesting and brilliant minds in our world today. So joining us on an open book is Andrew Kirtzman. He is the author of Giuliani, The Rise and Tragic Fall of America's Mayor. And full disclosure, I've known Mayor Giuliani since 1989, so I have a 33-year relationship with the mayor. And, Andrew, I'm fond of the mayor. Now, I am distressed by what has happened to the mayor, frankly, and your book is a wonderful expose of the good and the bad of Mayor Giuliani. And I just want to say this up front, and I think you know this because you interviewed me for this book. I looked up to the mayor, and I have a lot of respect for him. And in your first book, you write about almost a different person. So we're going to talk about that in a second. But start by taking us back to when you, Andrew Kirtzman, first met Rudolph Giuliani in 1992.
Sure. I was the Giuliani reporter when New York One, New York's all news television news station, went on the air. And even before the first day that we broadcast, I had breakfast with Giuliani at the Waldorf Astoria. And he laid out why he would win his rematch with David Dinkins. And he was just a fascinating candidate from the beginning. Dinkins was an historic figure. He came into City Hall with a huge amount of excitement. He was the first Black mayor. But I think he got kind of tied up in what I'd call the paralysis of good intentions. There was just kind of this sclerotic way of dealing things or not dealing with things as the city was kind of falling apart. Giuliani came out and said, said things that were just common sense, but were kind of considered heresy by the Democratic establishment, meaning there is no right to urinate in the street. There is no right to sleep in a subway car. Just like things that today sound like common sense, but back then were considered civil rights kind of red flags. And, he had no allegiance to the Democratic establishment, to liberal groups, to civil liberties groups, to the Black community. And that gave him a lot of license, political license, to crack some heads, so to speak.
So, and crack some heads he did. Did you like living in New York while he was mayor?
I mean, I've always loved living in New York. I'm born and raised here. But look, I mean, New York was facing nadir then. I mean, the streets were really out of control. The murder rate was high. Garbage was piled up in the streets. I mean, it was a city that had ceased to become governable, right? And one of the things that was so refreshing about Giuliani was that he proved to New York that New York City was governable, right? And it was, as a reporter, just watching him on a daily basis, stand as a solitary figure at City Hall against the tide of virtually every interest group in New York and hold fast and say, we're going to do this regardless of what you guys say. And then watch him kind of turn this city around was, as both a reporter and as a New Yorker, a really extraordinary thing to watch. And I don't want to kind of glamorize this because there was a huge downside to it as well, but we could get to that.
All right. Well, do we need that now, Andrew, in New York?
I think Eric Adams was elected under the same circumstances, right? Bill de Blasio was a very, left-leaning ideologue, right? While things started to fall apart. And I think New Yorkers decided we don't need ideology. We need someone to get the city under control.
Okay, so you're a very polite guy. So you're skirting the question. No, you're skirting the question. It's okay. You're allowed to skirt the question. You're a great author, but the truth of the matter is the city's an unmitigated disaster. And what works are Bloomberg and Giuliani-like policies, and it's actually fairer for everybody. Now, stop and frisks probably was a step too far. I think we all look back at that now and say that possibly that it was. But we need to make the city safer and cleaner. Otherwise, we're gonna end up like a lot of these other urban nightmares that are pocking the United States. But let me go back for a second, okay? Because I wrote Mr. Giuliani. I think I mentioned this to you. I wrote him a check for $250 in 1989. I was Young Republicans for Rudolph Giuliani. He was unsuccessful in that race, but I supported him again in 1993. I was slightly less younger, but at 29, sort of still young. And he won in 93, which was transformative for me. And so I'm always going back to that era of Giuliani. He did have a divot in his mayoral administration in 2001. Take us back for a second, because he was roundly unpopular in, let's call it, August of 2001.
It's a common misperception about what kind of political shape Giuliani was in before 9/11, right? I think the conventional wisdom, fed by a lot of kind of misleading media stories, has it that Giuliani was kind of, a failed, or not a failed, but a very unpopular politician, and the city couldn't wait to get rid of him at the time. It's just not true. I mean, a few months earlier in that year, his popularity plummeted during the Patrick Dorismond affair. It was, someone who was an innocent man who was killed by police. Giuliani mishandled the situation, and his numbers plummeted. By September of 2001, Giuliani's popularity was over 50%, which, as a political professional, is fine for an incumbent, especially someone who's been in office for 8 years, right? So I think that's been overstated a bit. But big picture, was the city kind of ready to move on from Giuliani after 8 years of bombast? I think that's a fair statement.
Okay. There's a quote at the start of the book, which I love. Okay. And he has said this, by the way, and I know this for certain. I don't care about my legacy. I'll be dead. Now, I've heard him say it. Okay. So I know he has said it.
Right.
And I'm sure you've referenced it from other people that have heard him say that. Do you believe that about the mayor? Do you believe he doesn't care about his legacy, that he'll be dead?
I do believe that. I do believe
so
that. For one thing, it kind of it's the kind of subtext to why he didn't cooperate with me for this book. I mean, I emphasized to him numerous times that this, no one else was writing a biography of you. This is it. This is what's going to live in history. If you want this book to be accurate and to, reflect your views, this is the time. And his feeling was, I don't care. And so I think that goes to the heart of the Giuliani story. And I write about this extensively in my book, which is his sense of moral certitude, that he's right and everyone else is wrong. And, it served him well during his mayoralty, as I said, when, the political forces were all against him and he stood his ground, but was catastrophic for his really terrible decisions that led his career astray and eventually damaged the country. I mean, to this day, he's this kind of fanatic about Joe Biden being corrupt. He's still defending the notion that the election was stolen from Trump, and he feels he's right and everyone's wrong, and that got him into trouble and got the country into great trouble.
When do you think he stopped caring, Andrew?
Stop caring about
his legacy.
About his legacy. It's a good question.
I don't care. Yeah.
Right. I think somewhere along the line after 2016, when Trump became president and the criticism of Giuliani snowballed, there was a sense again of, screw him, right? I'm on the side of morality. I'm on the side of truth. And, the humiliations just piled up, right? The Borat film, the hair dye press conference, right? The Four Seasons press conference. He would go on television and make kind of a fool of himself. In any number of those bombastic interviews with Chuck Todd and Andrew Cuomo, Chris Cuomo, he just stopped caring what the world believed about him.
Yeah, and look, it's very tragic for me. He was a famous prosecutor in the 80s, the most famous mayor in the 90s, a hero to many people, Time Magazine's Man of the Year after 9/11. But yet, and this is something you write beautifully about, there was always a conflict in there somewhere. There was always a struggle for his personal identity. Why is that, you think? And then when do you think he really started spiraling?
I think it's another good question. I think that Giuliani has always kind of been at war with the two sides of his personality, right? He's at war between the instinct to do the right thing and the instinct to preserve himself politically and advance himself politically. You saw it innumerable times during his mayoralty, right? When he came to the aid of the victims of that plane crash and, stood up to the head of the TWA. And any number of occasions where he really stood up for his people. And those were those were great instincts on his part. But he made so many self-interested moral compromises, right? Ranging from selling out after 9/11, right? Opening that consulting firm and trading on his America's mayor's name, to endorsing Donald Trump. And Trump, according to one of Giuliani's closest aides, Giuliani in 2016 thought of Trump as a carnival barker. And yet Trump was the only person knocking on his door. Giuliani had already crashed and burned in the 2008 presidential race. He really had no political future until Donald Trump came along. And then it was just one moral compromise after another throughout the Trump presidency. Now, Giuliani always considered himself a moral man. In fact, that's kind of key to his personality, that he was always on the side of morality. But there's nothing moral left about him. Everything he does now has kind of a quality of immorality.
Okay, so that's my greatest sadness, right? Because ultimately, when I was looking up to the mayor, I was like, ultimately, this guy is making right or wrong decisions in a principled sort of a way.
Right.
And now later in his life, he's just making impetuous decisions that have no basis on any of those principles. So this is why I find your book so fascinating, because you go into his career, you go into his life, and there seems to be this ambiguity or this two-sidedness to him. And it's tragic to me, Andrew. I'm just talking to you very candidly. It's tragic to me.
It is tragic. That's part of that's the subtitle to my book. It is a tragic story. It is a tragic story.
There's no question about that. There was a time where if you had asked me who was going to be the 2008 nominee for the Republican Party, I would have said Rudolph Giuliani. Of course, I got that wrong. He was the front runner for the entire year for president in the Republican primary.
That's right.
Before it went downhill. It is another great rise and fall story. Can you go into that a little bit? What were some of the lowest moments after that race, which you beautifully detail in the book?
Thank you. Well, it was one of the most kind of jaw-dropping revelations that I learned in the course of reporting this book. That I spoke extensively with Judith Giuliani, who was Rudy's wife at the time, enormously polarizing figure in Giuliani's world, had effectively separated him from all of his advisors, all of his friends. There was a constant war between the two. Very, very bright, very perceptive, but manipulative. And she told me a story about the weeks and months after Giuliani dropped out of the 2008 race, right? So he drops out in the end of January 2008. It is the end of his political career, the end of his dreams of becoming the first Italian Catholic president. He's now tarnished his 9/11 halo. His financial potential, his earnings potential has now dropped because he's no longer he's kind of shot his chance of, becoming president. Now he's kind of a political loser. And he falls into a depression. He starts to drink. Judy moves him to Florida, to her parents' house. The press finds out. And who takes him under his wing but Donald Trump? And Donald Trump opens up the doors to Mar-a-Lago. And Judith and Rudy move into Mar-a-Lago for over a month. She tells a story of his falling down constantly, being in what she called a clinical depression. She's a former nurse. She is prone to exaggeration, as I wrote, but there are enough people in Giuliani's orbit who confirm kind of his state of mind at the time to make a very persuasive case that if she wasn't telling 100% of the story, she was telling close to it.
I know her. I know obviously there's tension and struggle between the two of them now, but I actually know her a long period of time. And so
Right.
There's distress there for me too. You walk up to people on the street after 2001, super unambivalent about Mayor Giuliani. Most people say, okay, give the guy his due, help pull the city together, a great leader. You walk in New York City today, I think one of the most glaring things for me was on the 21st anniversary of the September 11th tragedy, the mayor is not standing there with the other dignitaries. He's glaringly absent. And so what's the opinion of the mayor in New York City, in your opinion, today?
He's an enormously unpopular politician, and I think that the biggest proof of that was the candidacy of his son, Andrew Giuliani, for governor, right? And Rudy Giuliani was just joined at the hip with his son, who was making this absolutely ludicrous effort to become governor with zero experience. But Giuliani made this almost a referendum on him, right? Andrew had no experience. He had no qualifications at all and seemed perfectly happy to let Giuliani become kind of the face of the campaign, let people vote based upon whether they loved him or not. And Andrew lost by 20 points. I mean, Giuliani in much of New York, not all of New York, but much of New York is a radioactive figure, is someone who is kind of a figure of ridicule, also almost a figure of embarrassment, right? New Yorkers elected him to 2 terms. On the other hand, there were precincts of New York where he campaigned, the more conservative area, Staten Island, where Rudy was still greeted as a hero. I think a lot of people still have a lot of gratitude towards him for what he did for New York on 9/11.
I know you're objective. I know you're a journalist. You get paid to be objective. Is it painful for you?
I am a journalist, and how I feel about it is not really important. So I'm going to skirt that question just a little. What I will say is this. I was with Giuliani on the morning of September 11th.
It's painful for me, Andrew. I just pointing that out. I'm just curious. Okay, I don't want to interrupt you. You were with him on September 11th. Yep.
I was with him on 9/11. I experienced that morning with him. I ran from the explosion of the second tower with him. I watched him display magnificent leadership. We were all scared to death. We were covered in sweat as we were kind of making this nomadic trip up Church Street, trying to find a location to take control of this, anarchic situation. I mean, they didn't even have a car, right? We had to walk a mile just to, find this small firehouse near Houston Street where someone got a crowbar to try to jimmy open the lock to the firehouse just so, he could find some place to run the city. He was the calmest person in the bunch. He was enormously eloquent, as you know. And so, for me to watch kind of Giuliani then and Giuliani now is, obviously a very kind of harrowing contrast, right? As a New Yorker, it's disappointing. How I feel about it emotionally, well, I can tell my family members.
He said something to me, and that he was reading Roy Jenkins's book Churchill. It was a biography that was on his nightstand,
Right.
about Churchill's backbone and his principles during the war, May 1940, when that war was breaking out and there was a panic overtaking the city of London. Now Churchill remained steadfast and calm, and he was really trying to channel that energy during 9/11, which of course you and I both know that he did.
Yep.
Let's go to Donald Trump for a second, because you also say in the book that in some ways Giuliani created the template for the Trump presidency.
Sure.
Trump admired Giuliani. We both know that. He admired the way he ran the city. You mentioned the fact that they got close after the presidential candidacy debacle.
Right.
Elaborate on that for us. What did you learn about the relationship between these two men while writing this book?
Sure. Well, I mean, going back to the 90s, Donald Trump was a developer who had, not a lot of sophistication about politics. He was a developer, and what he knew about politics and government were what served him, right? He needed zoning approvals, right? He needed the buildings apartment kind of approvals for his projects. But he was not a politically sophisticated person. And all he probably knew about politics was what he read in the New York Post every morning. But Giuliani was up there making this great impression upon the entire public. And if you listen to Trump now, he describes Giuliani always with these terms of glowing respect. And aides, I mean, you would know this better than I was. You were inside the Oval Office, but aides I spoke with said that he reserved this certain level of respect in the way he spoke about people, really to just kind of one person, right? He spoke about Giuliani unlike what he spoke about, how he spoke about other people. Sorry about mixing this all up, but he had a lot of respect for Giuliani. And according to the White House aides I spoke with, he admired Giuliani's take no prisoners approach to the mayoralty, his bombast, his war with the press, his failure, his refusal to ever apologize, the fact that he would be, sadistic with his political opponents. And this was the template for Trump. Giuliani was Trump before there was Trump.
I totally agree. I love that aspect of the book. Andrew Giuliani. Let's talk about him for a second, okay? Because I like Andrew. It's fair to say that nobody knows Mayor Giuliani better than Andrew. It's something that people don't realize about that relationship.
Well, they've had a very fraught relationship. They're obviously on very good terms now, but Judith caused a major schism in Rudy's relationship with his children, right? They didn't speak. Andrew and Caroline didn't speak to their father for years because they detested Judith so much. They, just like everyone else, they considered her enormously manipulative and also kind of threatened by them. Watching Andrew kind of bond or rebond once again with his father during his race for governor was kind of a level of kind of psychodrama that you don't really see on a political stage. Like watching him work through his feelings towards his father and watching his father work through his feelings towards his son was probably the only fascinating thing about Andrew's race for governor. They're they're father and son, and every family has this dysfunction. But
Right.
the difference is they played it out, before the cameras.
Yeah, and some of it obviously painful for me to watch. Again, this is an obscure fact, but I actually hired Andrew at the White House. I mean, he would have gotten the job anyway, but
Oh, interesting. Okay.
he was supposed to work for me in the OPL area, and then of course Priebus dislodged me from that position, which was fine. But Andrew ended up staying in the position for 4 years. All right, I want to have a little bit of fun with you, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Okay, I'm launching this astrology NFT, and so we've done some work here in my firm on astrology. Okay, and we've done a little research on you. Okay, I'm born on the 6th of January, so I'm a Capricorn. My team is telling me that you're born on the 24th of April. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so you're a Taurus. Not that you probably know anything about astrology, but you're supposed to be stubborn and very down to earth.
I can't imagine anyone would think of me in those terms.
Okay, all right. But Mr. Giuliani was born on the 28th of May in 1944. So he's a Gemini. And so the profile of the Gemini, you're smiling, is a split personality. That there are two sides to the person, and there's a good side and a bad side. Interestingly enough, Donald Trump is also a Gemini.
Okay.
So before I let you go, tell me one thing about the good side of Mayor Giuliani and one thing about the bad side.
He was very, very loyal to his friends, very loyal to his aides, fatherly towards the people who worked under him. He was very thoughtful in his decision making. This is kind of the Giuliani of the 90s I'm referring to. One of the interesting experiences I had in writing this book was trying to, at first, kind of pry these people open in terms of their cooperation. And for the first year, I mean, I spent 3 or 4 years writing this book. The first year, it was hard to get his old days to talk about him. And this is despite the fact that the vast majority are completely embarrassed by him now. But there's so much loyalty towards him for the old days. He was their father figure. They loved him. They respected him. I mean, that was the depth of the loyalty and how well he treated them. So that was the good side of Giuliani. The bad side of Giuliani was the person who would fabricate the Ukraine scandal, who would try to overturn a democratic election, who would use false information in testifying before the Georgia legislature, who would do anything to win, even if it meant overturning a democratic election, damaging the country. I mean, it's, as I said, it's immoral. It's immoral.
It makes me very, very sad. I don't think there's anybody other than a family member, perhaps, that knows him better than you. So what is something that people don't realize about Mayor Giuliani?
Well, one of the most interesting revelations to me was this psychiatrist's report about his father, right? Wayne Barrett, the wonderful investigative reporter who's no longer with us, revealed years ago that Harold Giuliani, Giuliani's father, had gone to prison for robbing a milkman. He was an enforcer for a mobbed up uncle of Giuliani's, carried a baseball bat, right, broke kneecaps. But there was a report on Harold shortly before he was sentenced by a court-appointed psychiatrist who diagnosed Harold as a pathological deviant, someone who had no concern for other people's feelings, right? The fact that Rudy Giuliani, grew up in a household with a figure like that, someone prone to violence, someone who didn't care about other people's feelings, is something that really you have to think about when you wonder what went wrong for Rudy Giuliani, right? His mother, Helen, was a very disciplined, loving, doting mother, but who was also almost impossible to please. So the net of that childhood was that Giuliani set out in the world determined to prove himself at all costs. I think what we've seen has borne that out.
I'm so glad I asked the question because it's such a fascinating answer. And of course, if you study Greek tragedy, in the house of Atreus, Atreus does something very diabolical, and Zeus says the sins of the father of Atreus will be casted down upon his descendants. And so it's a metaphor for people do mimic their parents, and they do go through their parents' struggles. There's almost like an emotional inheritance that comes from family trauma or personalities in a family. And it's almost as if Mayor Giuliani, in his desperate attempt to escape that, the stuff that you describe about Harold Giuliani, somehow he fell back into some of those elements. Is that fair to say?
Sure. Oh, absolutely. I mean, you need a psychiatrist as much as a journalist to understand Rudy Giuliani. I mean, his whole career has been one continuing psychodrama, from his cheating on his wives to, his these horrible, immoral choices he made along the way, to his relationship with his family, to his kind of dysfunctional relationship with Donald Trump. Right. I mean, the man's psychology is, part of the fun of being a reporter, trying to understand this guy.
Well, I so greatly appreciate you coming on. The title of the book is Giuliani, The Rise and Tragic Fall of America's Mayor. It's by Andrew Kirtzman. I really appreciate you being on an open book with me today. And I'm encouraging everybody to read the book because there's a lot in there, not only about his personality, but it's a story about life. And it's a story about the vectors and the places that life can take you if, frankly, you're not careful.
Well said. Thank you for having me.